But if you're age, I have to create a little bit of a gap here. If you're age 40 and below, you were never raised in a period that you perceived yourself as part of a Christian majority, nor even that there was that Christian consensus in the culture. You always perceived yourself as a very definitive minority in a pluralistic culture that was antagonistic to the faith. In which case, you did not perceive your major goal was to take control of the culture to influence it. Rather, your goal, as you perceived it, was to gain credibility in the culture so that you could influence it as a minority, influencing a greater pluralistic majority. Now, the older generation, 50 and above, would be the builders and boomers, often adopting a constraint theology. Those busters, Generation Xers and millennials, have often a very different expression of theology. They agree confessionally, agree biblically, but they have more of a compassion theology emphasis as they are seeking to gain credibility in a culture. So they will talk about helping the poor, the discriminated, AIDS victims, refugees, the environment. Now, the amazing thing is, these two groups often view each other as not being faithful, though they hold to the same confession, hold to the same scriptures, and yet their background means they are working at different directions toward the cause of influencing the culture for Christ. That becomes important to see as you look at page 9, when you recognize, of course, evangelicalism isn't the only influence. In fact, evangelicalism and the PCA, which is largely Anglo, has to face the realities of number 18 on page 9, which is the recognition that we are transitioning from an Anglo-majority culture in the United States. In our children's adulthood, those who are Anglo will no longer be more than half of the nation. Our culture is rapidly changing. And if we continue to minister only to those who are white and suburban, we will not be ministering to the soon majority of our culture. There are global challenges, page 10 mentions. The most rapid growth of Christianity in world history is happening right now. Did you know that? Now, most people don't know that. Why don't we experience that? Because the growth is not happening in North America. It's happening in the southern hemispheres. That's where Christianity is growing so rapidly, more rapidly than it's ever grown before. Number 2 says there is actually a recentering of global Christianity and missionary origins. No longer is North America and Western Europe the center of Christianity. There are more Christians outside of North America than within North America. Where are they? In the southern hemispheres, in the majority world. And number 4 reminds us there are results of that. The majority world church is deserving and demanding of influence on global Christianity. The Anglican African archbishops actually more and more perceive themselves as the moral compass of Christianity, perceiving that the West has abandoned the scriptures on the issues of sexuality and gender, and therefore believing they have to hold the line because those in the West are not. There are great divisions that will continue to occur as China probably becomes the largest national Christian church of the next century. That's where more Christians will be in any nation than any other nation in the coming century, in China. And there are different issues of how men and women relate in China, as there are different ways in which even evangelicals in the United States are talking about gender issues. All these will have to be factored as we consider what is our role holding to biblical standards in the coming generations as we wish to be an influence in global Christianity. If you look at page 12, it reminds you that there are not only external challenges, there are some internal challenges for the PCA. Number 1, we are experiencing slowed growth with lack of a rallying strategic plan. Now, why have we not been able to rally with a strategic plan with all these challenges that we know about? Page 13 tries to be somewhat honest about some of our differences. Number 5 says, on page 13, we exist in the PCA with a culture of suspicion and caricature perpetuated by past narratives. We're always talking about encroaching liberalism or overreaching bureaucracies, and those narratives that we tell on and about one another limit our ability to work together. there are also strong perspectival differences among us. There are divisions between the haves and the have-nots. There are large churches, there are small churches. There are differences in size and salaries and recognition and influence. And often what is characterized as theological debate actually has another foundation behind it with the disparities that exist between the haves and the have-nots. There are great generational divides. I've already mentioned some of those. There are regional divides. There are strong southern identities and northeastern identities and western autonomy identities. And if you don't live in those parts of the country, you may not recognize how strong those identities are and how people in that part of the country may feel talked down to or be suspicious of people in other parts of the country. And those regional divides keep us apart. There are obvious perspectival divides. We talk about there are aggressive TRs and cynical progressives. There are the doctrinalists versus the missionalists, the Southern Presbyterian theologians versus the Continental Reformed theologians, the traditionalists versus the emergents, the fundamentalists versus the transformationists, planters versus providers, younger pastors versus older pastors. Now, honestly, my intention here is to be an equal opportunity offender. But the reality is, this is the way we talk about one another. And because we put the labels on and become suspicious of one another, we find it difficult to work together. We have to work together, and there are good reasons to do so. Page 15 identifies some of the opportunities that are in our culture. It's not all negative. Some of the pressures upon us are actually pressuring the culture to consider matters of faith. Number one, there is a pervasive spiritual longing that's often evident in the explosion of alternative spiritualities. There's a relational longing. As postmodernism destroys families, there's a longing for relationships. 3, there's a longing for something certain. In a culture that's eroding, isn't there someone that holds to something certain? Isn't there truth? Number 4, there's a longing for racial reconciliation. Look at the last presidential campaign as our nation longs to overcome differences. 5, there is still cultural regard for piety, as long as it is humble and non-judgmental. You know, the nation as a whole still does not like the restrictions that we wish were on things like abortion. But it sure did respect Mother Teresa. Why? Humble, non-judgmental, yet standing for truth. 6, there's an appreciation for biblical preaching. Even where there's an erosion in attendance in the church, we have to say the PCA is widely admired for its commitment to biblical preaching. Listen, across the PCA, less than 15% of those in the PCA were raised in conservative Presbyterian churches. Why are they in our churches? Because they say we preach the Bible. There's an opportunity for a church that will be true to Scripture. There's a lack of grace understanding in Christian media and most pulpits, as there's a preoccupation with either moralism or prosperity or politics. There's an opportunity for the gospel of grace. 8, there's the rapid spread of global Christianity. 9, there are deep disappointments in postmodernism. As relationships come unglued, there is vast loneliness and people looking for other answers. 10, there's a loss of confidence in the economy, in experts, and government. 11, there's a lack of institutional or denominational loyalty. Now that sounds like that would hurt us. But actually, more people are coming into the PCA from other denominations than are leaving the PCA. This is actual opportunity as people are looking for a biblical, doctrinally committed church. And of course, number 12, there's a vast fear of terrorism and war. Page 17 looks at these dynamics. Here's what we're like as a denomination. Here's the pressures from the world. Here are the opportunities that are in our culture. And the coordinators, the chairmen of the boards, and the moderators got together and they said, if we're going to develop a strategic plan, we have to answer these questions that are on page 17. I'll let you read those at another time. But I want to move on to the plan itself and see what is there that comes out of this analysis and out of our commitments as a church. Now, you can't remember all that I've said, and the plan can't come across, 17, 18, 19, 20 different perspectives and try to deal with them. We said we would do this. We would identify 3 major themes. And then we would use those themes to explain how we would be addressing all the issues that I've mentioned thus far in the analysis. Now, the three major categories are these. We said first, we would identify how we as a church can develop safe places. If people feel they are not safe when they bring up ideas, talk to one another or about one another, how can we find safe places to talk and discuss things with one another? We said, how can we develop more seats? Certain people seem to feel ostracized. There's certain parts of the nation and the world we're not reaching at all. How do we speak to a broader culture and involve people outside of the traditional ranks of the PCA in that decision making?